Few people know that when they take the crosstown freeway through Stockton, California, they're passing through the remnants of a once bustling community.
All roads in America with Filipinos led to Stockton.
It was home to the largest Filipino population outside of the Philippines, a neighborhood whose little-known history was integral to the development of Central California.
Filipinos owned garages, cafes, restaurants, laundries. There were so many businesses that you, as a Filipino, could frequent because they had the things that you needed.
Like many immigrants before them, Filipinos faced backbreaking work, low wages, and at times, extreme racism. Yet they still referred to Stockton as El Dorado, or the City of Gold, and sought this place to fulfill their dreams. When the Philippines became a territory of the U.S. in 1898, Filipinos could freely enter the country. Recruited by the thousands as cheap labor to work the Hawaiian sugar plantations, they quickly began to migrate to the U.S. mainland.
So Filipinos basically were not occupying the upper levels of the socio-economic sectors. They weren't the high-end workers. They were agricultural workers, domestic service workers, which is what the economy needed at that time.
Following the seasons, they traveled up and down the West Coast, harvesting crops from California to Washington and working the fishing canneries in Alaska during the winter season. Stockton provided a hub where Filipinos could always return.
Filipinos arrived in Stockton mainly because they were recruited to Stockton. Stockton was the center of the agricultural activity in the Central Valley of California. And of course, many labor contractors that were responsible for hiring Filipinos attracted them specifically to Stockton.
Little Manila at its height was a lively four-block area pocketed next to Chinatown and Japantown. To some Stocktonians, this area south of Main Street was the notorious Skid Row. For Filipinos, however, it was the closest thing they had to a hometown.
From the late 19th century on, it was known as the Oriental Quarter. And this is where Chinatown was. And as Japanese immigrants start coming to the Central Valley and to Stockton, they established Nihonmachi nearby. And this is anywhere from a 6 to 10 block area south of Main Street. And when Filipinos come to the United States, they find that the only places that will welcome them are the people of the Oriental Quarter. It's an extremely diverse neighborhood. From the outside, though, most white Stocktonians kind of just generalize the area as Chinatown.
My dad came from Lobok, Bohol in the Philippines. People told him to go to California, to a place called Stockton, because there was a lot of Filipinos there. So we came down by train, and they brought us up to the Lincoln Hotel, and I looked out the window on the main street, and I could see so many Filipinos in my life. From Main Street to Lafayette Street, you can see and smell all kinds of food in that town. The Filipino, Chinese, Japanese, they were making biko there.
Lafayette and El Dorado Street becomes this crossroads of not just the Filipino community in Stockton, but in a sense the Filipino community on the West Coast. If you were looking for your cousin and you just recently arrived, you would come to El Dorado Street because you knew there were thousands of Filipinos, especially during asparagus season, lining the streets.
In Stockton, Filipino workers in particular became synonymous with asparagus cutting, considered one of the toughest crops to harvest.
The hardest work that I ever done was the asparagus. You had to get the asparagus out of the field because during the hot days, that sun will soak up the liquid in the grass, asparagus. We called grass in those days. And if you got it to the wash house dry, it's because they weigh it. See, you get paid by the weight. And they want to make sure you got that grass into the wash house. But if it was late, the guy's going to get mad because you didn't pick it up right away. When working in the grass, that wind was just blowing out in that peat dust. You couldn't see the hand in front of your face. I wore 2 pairs of pants, 3 shirts, a bandana over my head, and a scarf, and goggles. Yeah, goggles. And you had to tie your shoestrings around your shoes because the peat dirt gets up into your pants leg you're gonna itch like crazy when you sweat. After we finished working in the fields and get into the bunkhouse, you had to sweep down the bunkhouse so you get all that dust out of there. That was miserable.
There are very racist arguments that farmers make, saying that Filipinos do this work because they're shorter and therefore closer to the ground. But I'd like to think, the ways that work crews were organized in terms of hometowns, in terms of provinces, and the relationships that these men had with each other and the obligations that they had with each other really contributed to the efficiency of their work and their reputation for being extremely skilled workers.
For picking 100 pounds of asparagus a day, Filipino workers received just 90 cents, less than half the amount paid to their white counterparts. This hard-earned cash was often sent to waiting parents and family members back in the Philippines.
Filipinos and Filipinas come to the United States with the intent of bringing their family out of poverty. And their American colonial teachers tell them that they're going to come to the United States, that this is such a land of opportunity, that they're going to pick gold up off of the streets. And the irony is that the little Manila is centered around El Dorado Street. They're going to return in a few months as these extremely wealthy men who are coming back to save their families and bring their provinces and their barrios out of poverty. And that doesn't necessarily happen.
The early groups of Filipinos who arrived in Stockton were mostly young single bachelors, eager to liven up Little Manila and ready to show some style.
But who were these guys who arrived in America? And this is not my imagination. They arrived, you would think they were movie stars. The way they dressed, the way they smiled, their mustaches.
They really prided themselves in the way they looked, and that was combing their hair, making that straight line down the center or the side of their scalp, just so they would look dashing.
The Filipino men dressed, whether they were from Chicago, New York, Seattle, they all dressed the way they dressed in Stockton. They all were flashy. They wore suits that were just unbelievable. They would never go into a store and buy a $20 suit and hit the streets. These guys came out looking like movie actors, and yet they were common laborers working in the agricultural industry.
Pinoys, as Filipinos are sometimes called, sought out the American dream in new cars, gambling dens, and dance hall girls.
You also have stories where Filipinos, with the best intentions of saving money, end up losing all their money in the gambling halls or in the taxi dance halls or, on clothes and on cars. And one of the things you have to remember is that when these young men and women are coming to the United States, they're in their late teens. They're in their early 20s. This is the first money they're ever earning in their entire lives. And this is also, the birth of the consumer culture in the United States.
My father opened the Zao Social Club. Now they had some place to go. It was some kind of entertainment for them. And my dad got girls from San Francisco, Los Angeles, Sacramento. About 20, 25 girls working there. But they're all Caucasian girls. And these Pinoys, they're all young guys from the islands. They had never danced with a Caucasian woman. It was something for them. And they'd come in that dance hall dressed up like peacocks. Taxi dance, you grab one girl and go from one to another, just like taxi cabs. And then here in Stockton, we call them dime jigs. The dime jig girls, 10 cents to dance. The jig was the dance.
They loved to dance. They would do the foxtrot, the jitterbug, the swing, the tango, any of that. And they prided themselves in being dancers. I appreciate the role of the taxi dancers and the ladies of the evening because they took the sexual drive of the Filipino men and kept it away from us. They treated us like relatives, They would feel that our family was their family. And so these gals did us a favor. They saved our souls from damnation.
Because migrant farm working was not conducive to family life, Filipino women and children were not encouraged to immigrate. Limited to a ratio of 14 Filipino males to every 1 female, Filipino men instead often married women of other races. Though many states prohibited Filipinos from marrying whites, a new generation of mestizos, mixed-race Filipinos, was born.
My father came from Luzon, and my mother is white. So they were not able to get married in Arizona because in 1931, Arizona had an anti-miscegenation law. My mother and father had to go to Lordsburg, New Mexico to get married because they allowed Filipinos to marry whites.
On my mom's side, it's black and Irish and Native American, and on my father's side, he's Ilocano from the Philippines. When I stop and think about it, our family reunions and different family gatherings, it's every color of the rainbow.
Whites in Stockton are absolutely shocked and angered that Filipinos would dare date white women. My God, the affront that these young Filipino men wearing these incredible suits that they worked so hard in the fields to buy, walking around downtown Stockton with these white women on their arms, really incited a lot of racist anger.
These boiling racial tensions, along with fierce competition for jobs during the Depression, culminated in race riots and clashes between whites and Filipinos all over the West Coast. On January 29, 1930, a bomb shattered the front of the Filipino Federation building in Stockton.
Well, during those days, that racism was something that wasn't against the law. We were never allowed to go north of Main Street where you would be spotted because you were dark-skinned. My father would never go into town unless he had his brother or his cousin or some of his townmates with him, and that was mainly for protection. If anybody wanted to come up to you and just make a derogatory remark, then they would do it, and there was no recourse. It would only make things worse.
Back in the late 30s and early 40s, yeah, there was feeling of discrimination back then, because I remember one time this guy, Johnny Mercado, and I, we went to some hotel, and right there on the steps, no Filipino allowed. That, I was shocked to see that. That really amazed me. But it just didn't dawn on me at that time of being discrimination. Just, well, they don't want us, they don't want us, so we took off. But later on, you found out that you couldn't go on the other side of Main Street, or you couldn't own property.
In the Fox Theater, which is the main theater in Stockton, we were not allowed, Filipinos were not allowed to sit in the center part of the movie theater. They were relegated to the side aisles against the walls, and that went on through probably the 40s and maybe even the 50s.
To understand racism and to understand the ways that Filipinos were treated, you have to really understand racism and the constructions of race and race relations in the United States at the turn of the century. Filipinos are, in a sense, the only Asian immigrants entering at this time in which the United States has essentially said we are closing our doors to anybody who does not fit this racial stock that we imagine that Americans should be made up of, which is white, Anglo-Saxon, Protestant racial stock. And so Filipinos are also coming into an area that is populated by people who had migrated from the Midwest and the South and brought with them to California their ideas of racial superiority, rigid segregation. And so Stockton is an extremely segregated city. Why do they feel that they can wear these suits and drive these cars and date anybody they want to? Well, that's what their American teachers tell them in the Philippines. It's important to remember that they grow up in an American colonial culture, and they come to the United States in part because of the extreme poverty that capitalism and American colonialism brings, that's for sure. But they also come to the United States because of the movies that they see, because of the stories that they hear, because of the teachers who tell them that America is this land of opportunity. They don't tell them about racism in the United States. They don't tell them that they're not allowed to go certain places, that they're not going to be able to become citizens.
In 1934, motivated by anti-Filipino sentiments, Congress passed the Tidings-McDuffie Act, which later granted independence to the Philippines, but restricted immigration of Filipinos to America to just 50 per year.
1934 Tidings-McDuffie Act changed the status of Filipinos from nationals, which was this kind of in-between status as colonial subjects, to aliens.
1 year later, Congress attempted to deport Filipinos from the U.S. with the Repatriation Act, a one-way ticket back to the Philippines.
For many of these Filipinos to go back home on this one-way ticket and to have to promise to never come back was really seen as a slap in the face from the American government. And so Filipinos knew what was happening. They knew that Congress was essentially trying to stop Filipino immigrants from coming into the United States. And then with the Repatriation Act, they saw that Filipinos are essentially being told to get out. And it just becomes a rallying point for Filipinos to come around. And another reason why Filipinos really feel like they need to create community organizations in order to give themselves, give each other support. There was a Masonic order that was brought over from the Philippines called the Gran Oriente. There was the Leonarios del Trabajo, there was the Caballeros de Masalang, and there was the Filipino Federation of America. And so Filipinos in Stockton could choose from any number of these fraternal orders to find companionship, to find support, to find family.
Stockton leaders like Claro Candelario sought out justice for the Filipino community. He spoke against racism, the gambling halls, and other businesses taking advantage of Filipinos, as well as the unfair labor practices against farm workers.
I think really and truly, my dad felt that there has to be something better from the Filipinos also. But when he came to Stockton, he found out exactly how these agricultural workers were really treated, where they live. And he just got involved in the movement.
In 1939, Filipino labor leaders organized an asparagus strike in Stockton, demanding the restoration of higher wages. This strike was so successful that all but 2 growers agreed to their terms.
I'm happy to say that my dad, in some way, was able to be of help to the Filipinos. And if his dream of the Filipino having a better image than what it was, that is his legacy.
World War II was a turning point for Filipinos. Eager to prove their patriotism, Filipinos volunteered en masse to fight the Japanese. The 1st and 2nd Filipino infantry regiments were formed, and these wartime efforts led to improved status for Filipinos.
My grandfather, Devlin, volunteered, and he was in the 1st Filipino Infantry Regiment, and he was involved in that mass naturalization ceremony that you often see pictures of thousands of, Filipinos kind of lined up taking their citizenship oath. And with citizenship, now you can buy land, now you can vote. This is an incredible change for Filipinos.
After World War II, the Filipino community, like the rest of the nation, flourished and took new shape.
A larger number of Filipinos start coming in because they are war brides. Men who fought overseas in the 1st and 2nd Filipino Infantry Regiments. When they go back to the Philippines, there's an opportunity for them to meet and marry young Pinays.
Young families, better financial possibilities, and a new identity as American citizens all created a sense of community and belonging that hadn't existed before. Little Manila was no longer a bachelor society. It became a gathering place for Filipino families.
The sports that the Filipinos had back in those days was very few. So we decided to get our own team up. And so each town would get their own basketball team. Livingston, Sacramento, Vallejo, San Francisco, LA. We'd get together and have a tournament. All of us guys. It was get to know each other, meet new girls,
My dad had this queen contest going on for a Miss Philippines.
The queen contests were popularity contests. You had to sell votes, and they were $1 a piece. The fraternal organizations would use this as a fundraiser. Actually, that was a big moneymaker at that time.
Anita was one of the most beautiful mestizas that I have met. And Anita was one of the candidates. And she won.
What did I do with the money? I actually bought furniture for our home. I bought a stove, a dining room set, and a living room set with $800.
The work of thousands of Filipinos went into making California's Heartland what it is today, a multi-billion-dollar agricultural industry that makes California the 5th largest economy in the world. Yet few people are aware that Filipino farm workers played a crucial part in one of the great labor movements of American history, collaborating with Cesar Chavez.
The conditions in the fields were amazing what these guys put up with. A gentleman by the name of Larry Idleon was in Stockton, and he was part of a labor movement to get Filipinos involved in this whole issue of unfair labor in the fields.
We have 1965 where people think that, wow, the United Farm Workers, Chicanos started this movement, but actually it was the Filipinos that dragged the Mexicans into the labor movement. The Filipinos from Sacramento, Stockton, the Central Valley are basically following the crop rotation. They're down in the Coachella Valley. They get to Delano.
And so the workers were kind of upset already about what's happening, considering that they came from Coachella and they were getting $1.40 there. And here in Delano, it was $1.10.
Filipinos go out on strike. Big problem. The Mexicans are going to become the strike breakers. So Idleon then goes up to Chavez and says, look, we need your support. And Chavez says, no, I can't give you my support. Idleon says, why not? Chavez says, I'm not ready. We'll wait 2 or 3 more years. And Idleon says, no, we go on strike now, and you join us, or when you go out and strike in 1968, we're going to break your strike.
Larry Idleon joined his group of Filipinos with Cesar Chavez's group of Chicanos, and together they created the United Farm Workers, the most successful farm labor union known today. By the 1960s, the Filipino community in Stockton began to move away from the downtown area. City officials started to clear out the ethnic neighborhoods for urban redevelopment. A few years later, the crosstown freeway construction destroyed most of Little Manila.
The freeway construction and demolition started in 1967. And then when federal money for freeway construction dried up in the 1970s, it became a freeway to nowhere. And so it was this monument to the ways that people of color in Stockton had been kind of really pushed aside in the favor of freeway construction and urban redevelopment.
Right down here was a store. Right here was a garage where a lot of the guys used to hang out in the 50s, used to make their hot rods. Right down here was Mrs. Segundo Reyes' beauty shop. That's where it's at.
Little Manila was devastated. I mean, they cleared almost everything but the Mariposa Hotel and the Rizal Social Club and what was once the AFL-CIO Union Hall, which is now the Emerald Restaurant. I couldn't believe what happened.
The Manongs, the older Filipino men, and others who resided in the hotels of Little Manila were relocated by the city.
Some stayed here that they called it the Gohoy Lodge. They had their own clubs, the Masalong, the Legionarios, the Iloilo Circle.
The last few remnants of this important community are barely apparent, but its significance lives on. Filipino organizations are fighting to preserve the remaining buildings, now deemed an endangered historical site.
What you are standing in front of is the Filipino Plaza. The Filipino Plaza was dedicated in 1972, and a group of Filipino activists and people in Filipino organizations in Stockton realized that thousands of manongs, thousands of old-timers were losing their homes because of redevelopment. And so these Filipinos got together, they called themselves the Associated Filipino Organizations, and this is the nation's first Filipino-American planned and inspired affordable housing project in the nation.
My feelings of preserving Little Manila are real strong. It represents a part of history that will forever be a part of California.
Do you want to bring your grandchildren and point to an empty lot and say, this was where this important strike was planned? Or point to, a dilapidated building that is about to be torn down and say, this was where this organization met? Because what does that say about, how we value our history? that if we allow our historic places to become parking lots and to become empty lots, you know, what does that say about what we think about ourselves as Filipino Americans and how much we value our long history in the United States?
California's history is so entrenched in the things that happen in the Little Manila area. I seriously feel I'm standing on Manong's shoulders.
Whether they're the child of an immigrant who came in the 1980s or they're the great-grandchild of a Filipino couple who came in the 1920s, it's my hope that when students leave the tour, they have this connection to Stockton and to really think about the struggle of Filipinos to survive.
On the count of 3, 1, 2, 3.
To preserve these buildings and to preserve this history, that's our utang na loob, that's our debt to them for what they've done for us.
To order a DVD copy of this program, call 888-814-3923 or visit kvie.org/viewfinder.